Well, welcome. I'm Peter Shergold from the Centre for Social Impact, CSI, and on behalf of my colleague Cheryl Curnow and myself, welcome to Yakety Yak this evening with Peter Thompson. I am particularly pleased this evening that we are being hosted by NAB, the National Australia Bank, who, as you've heard, are a major sponsor of the Centre. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome Ken Henry, who will be interviewed this evening. I'm proud to say I knew Ken before he became the Henry Review. And I knew him, of course, when he was Secretary of the Treasury and I was in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. I knew him as a very, very fine economist, but I also knew him as a very good and supportive colleague in the Australian Public Service. And I am delighted that he accepted the invitation to be interviewed this evening. So please welcome Peter Thompson and Ken Henry.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Ken, for agreeing to this interrogation.
It's good. Oh, interrogation. That's not how you described it earlier. It's good to be here.
I want to start with a story which is quite touching about your father, who walked off the family dairy farm, along with your family, and then took part in the logging industry, inland from Taree on the New South Wales mid-north coast. You found yourself as a boy looking at the work of his logging, examining a big rainforest log in the bush. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's true. He walked off the family farm in the middle of a drought, and this was in the early 1960s. And as a younger man, well, a boy really, he'd left school early and gone into the timber industry, cutting railway sleepers in the main. But when the dairy farm went broke in the middle of the drought, he went back to the timber industry. Now, one afternoon, my two brothers and I were freshly home from school, and our father unusually showed up home from work. He normally didn't come home until after sunset, of course. And he was full of excitement, and he bundled the three boys up into the car and took us down to the sawmill, and he showed us a log. And he had spent the day cutting this log out of one of the state forests of New South Wales. And it was an immense thing, and it was sitting on the back of a truck. I've subsequently driven behind one of these trucks that had pine logs on it, and had the opportunity to count the number of logs. And typically the size truck I'm talking about has 40 to 50 pine logs on it. On this occasion there was one log on the truck. That's how big the log was. And young boys, I was still in primary school, we got into a conversation with our father about this log. And the sorts of questions we asked, well, you can imagine the first question was, how old was the tree that this log came from? And my father was very knowledgeable in Australian hardwoods. In fact, the forestry department used to employ him from time to time to get in a plane and fly over the state forest and estimate the amount of commercial timber in a stand of trees. So he was quite knowledgeable, and he said, well, at a minimum 300 years, quite possibly even more than 500 years old. So that was impressive to us. The next question, I think, was, well, how many houses could you build with this log? And he said, and I had the opportunity subsequently to check these details with him. He said, well, it would make the framing for 3 family homes, just this one log. And then I think the next question was, well, after the observation, wow, this must be worth a lot of money. The question was, well, Dad, how much did you get paid for chopping this tree down? And he told us what his hourly wage rate was, and it was a pittance, of course. And I know it was me who asked this next question. Well, who gets the rest of the money? And he said, well, of course, the state government gets some money out of this. They take some royalties. And I said, well, how much would that be? And he told me, I forget the sum, but it was even less than he was paid to chop the log down. So again, it was a pittance. And it was at that point that I realised there was something wrong here. You know, this didn't make sense. I mean, all the rest of the money obviously went to the sawmill owner, and then of course those who are involved downstream, so to speak, in the processing of this log. But the fact that a tree of 300 to 500 years of age, an immense thing, the property of the people of New South Wales, that's what it was, the property of the people of New South Wales, could be taken out of the forest and the people of New South Wales receive only a few dollars in exchange for this extraordinary asset that they had owned.
As I remember, if the tree's left in the bush, because it's got too big a pipe, as they're called.
Correct. Yeah, this is an interesting thing. In years later, when I was discussing these things with my father, after I'd started studying economics and understood how these things might come about, I remember him saying to me that he had cut down thousands of trees like this and left them lying on the forest floor. And left them lying on the forest floor because, as far as the sawmill operator was concerned, the person for whom he worked, unless the hardwood tree had a rim of hardwood at least 30 centimetres, he said a foot thick, around the hollow pipe, because they all have hollow pipes in them, or just about all. Unless there was at least a foot of solid timber around that hollow pipe, the sawmill wasn't interested in it. And significantly, if the timber was left on the forest floor, no royalty was payable. And so my father's job was to go through the forest, chopping down these trees, these 500-year-old trees, checking to see the size of the pipe, and if the pipe was too large, that's the hollow bit, if the pipe was too large, just leave them lying on the forest floor. No royalty payable. No cash returned to the people of New South Wales.
You were troubled about it. Were you still troubled about this story?
Well, I'm still troubled about it. The situation's not much different today. That's the extraordinary thing. But I was very troubled about it at the time, and in reflecting on it subsequently, I realised that it had a strong motivating influence on me. It was my first exposure to a public policy issue. I was very young, but this is a significant public policy issue. And not only was it a significant public policy issue, but it meant that I became aware of public policy through observing failure, not success.
What stimulated your interest in economics?
Probably the analytical content. That's what stimulated my interest as a boy. I was always interested in mathematics. And I was interested in the analytical techniques of economics. But I was also interested in what was going on around me. I used to take a keen interest, I guess I was a bit, even in primary school, reading books on public affairs. Obviously not very complex books on public affairs, but I remember whilst I was still at primary school, in fact I was very young, not many years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, taking an interest in that. And I'm not quite sure why I should have, but I did. So I had an interest in public...
the world was about to blow up.
Yeah, but it was
something to do with it.
As a young kid, I guess. But I'm not sure that was what held my interest in the topic. I'm really not sure. But as far as the economics was concerned, it was analytical content. So I studied economics at the University of New South Wales, took an honours degree there. I was studying law at the same time. And I got so engrossed in economics as a discipline that I didn't finish the law. And so I did the honours year in economics, and then I went straight off to do a PhD in economics. I followed my honours supervisor, or one of my honours supervisors, across to New Zealand, actually. And he was a theoretician. To a young person interested in analytics, he was a very attractive person, highly intellectual, mathematical economist, and I followed him, and I did my PhD under his supervision. But he was a New Zealander, and he'd gone back to New Zealand because he had concerns about the state of public policy in his home country. Even though he was an abstract theoretician, that was his field, with publications in the most technical of economic journals, Econometrica and so on, for those of you in the audience who are aware of this stuff. He was worried about the state of public policy in his own country, and he became quite active as a commentator on public affairs in New Zealand. And I found myself drawn into this. And actually, it felt like coming home. That's what it felt like. It felt like this is actually what my study has been about, is public policy.
There was a wave of econometrics taking hold of various schools like ANU at the time.
Yeah.
So you could have stayed surfing that wave, but
Sure.
you were lecturing at the University
I
of
was
Canterbury
lecturing
in
at the University of
Christchurch,
Canterbury,
and you chose to leave it and join Treasury.
Yeah. I came to the Treasury in August of 1984, so it's 25 years ago. And the reason I came to the Treasury was that sitting in New Zealand as an Australian in the early 1980s, in a period of public policy failure. I mean, those times in New Zealand were very difficult times.
Under Muldoon.
Under Muldoon. And then looking across the Tasman, back at my home country, and in 1984 in particular, seeing a lot of stuff going on, a lot of exciting policy work going on, I thought, this is crazy. I should be part of this. If I am really as interested in public policy as I think I am, I should be part of this. And so I sought a job in the Treasury, and of course I haven't strayed from it since.
Let's dive into the role of economics in public policy.
Yeah.
You've been involved in some, well, particularly taxation.
Right.
And that's been a thread from...
It has.
Because you were involved in the GST, the
Sure.
initial GST
well,
thinking in 83,
the first job I took in the
84,
Treasury was actually in the tax reform bunker, as we called it in those days, out of which emerged the draft white paper on tax reform that went to the tax summit in the middle of 1985, option C, as it's known.
I want to park the discussion about that because that's interesting just to see the process of grappling with public policy change over a series of decades. But let's leave that. Let's go to the bigger question of the role of government in a contemporary society like ours. What are the limits to government? And Centre for Social Impact's interested in the role of the not-for-profits.
Of course.
What you talk about gaps, for example, things governments can't do.
There are indeed. Look, there are things that governments should not try to do, in my view, for the reason that, for the most part, private citizens looking after themselves can be expected to do a reasonably good job, or at least a job at least as good as what government could do if it were to intervene. So there are things that government should not try to do, which doesn't stop governments trying to do them from time to time. But there are huge gaps that in a solely private sector economy that governments must fill. I say must. Governments have not always filled these gaps, but citizens have found reason to have governments fill these gaps. So the most obvious example is the provision of a public good. Let's take defence. Governments have not always had responsibility for defence in all societies, but a form of government has usually been found to provide defence of citizens in most societies. That's a pretty obvious one. It's called the public good. Economists talk about public goods as being things from which no citizen can really be excluded and which no citizen can really appropriate. And defence would be something of that sort.
But even when you raise defence, there's this huge area of defence, procurement, which is in public hands, which could easily be done privately.
Absolutely. Defence procurement could be done privately, and in some societies defence procurement may well be done privately. I haven't bothered to check, but defence procurement could be done privately. And of course, it raises another very interesting point, which is that private commercial interests are often the beneficiaries of government activity. So those who win defence contracts are commercial beneficiaries of government activity, even though the reason that the government is involved in defence is defence, or presumably it is, rather than being involved in defence in order to award commercial advantage to commercial interests. One would hope that that was the case. Obviously, in all societies at all times, one can't say that that is the case. But there are many things that governments can do that the private sector would be incapable of doing. Our road network is a case in point. Just imagine for a moment if every road in Australia had to be provided privately. It's feasible, I guess, but just imagine what a mess we would have. And of course there'd be large elements of our national road infrastructure that simply would not exist because no commercial operator would be able to would be able to make sufficient money from it to recover the cost of construction. So, but what about education? Education can obviously be provided by private organisations. Indeed, private organisations do provide education. But if all education were privately provided, most Australians would probably end up with a pretty rudimentary education, whilst some Australians would enjoy a very high quality education. Governments therefore involve themselves, and on the express wish of their citizens, involve themselves in ensuring that all Australians have access to education of a level of quality that the citizens demand.
Well, if you accept that private-public divide you're talking about, so there's an area of activity which is obviously better done by the private sector, there's the area you're talking about which is better done by the public sector. Where is the limits to where governments can do well?
Governments, politicians, and I'm not going to say, I don't intend this comment pejoratively, but politicians are pretty good at understanding on any issue exactly where the 50th percentile is.
They've got the polls there to tell them, even if they don't know themselves.
Well, indeed they do. Indeed they do. And so I think we can, as a general rule, I think we can rely on a democratic political process to satisfy the needs, maybe a bit more than the needs, of the majority. Not all of the time, but for much of the time. That still leaves a great deal of important issues unattended to. If that's all we had, a great deal of important issues unattended to. And it's not only in those areas, but it's particularly in those areas that one finds not-for-profit organisations, community-based organisations rising, creating themselves to plug a gap that they identify, a gap that the majority would not consider sufficiently important to see plugged. Well, not sufficiently important that it would be raised as a significant political issue.
How do you deal with this? In conversation with Peter Shergold, he uses the term, the public service is industrial-sized.
Yep.
You can mobilise big resources and do big things, big-scale things.
160,000 Australian public servants, excluding defence, yeah.
And has that wonderful power to spend taxation that's raised by law.
Indeed.
But there are things at a community level which a big industrial-sized public sector finds difficult to deliver in terms of services.
Sure.
Yet, on the other hand, the not-for-profits tend to be so small in scale that they struggle too.
They don't have the financial resources or the human capital, to be able to deliver. Well, that's true. What does one make of that? It's true.
That's what I was going to ask you. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Well, I can tell you what I make of it personally. What I make of it personally is that I myself have become involved in community organisations. I don't think we will ever find a substitute for that. I think people who are sufficiently motivated by a deficiency in either the activities of government or, and it's not necessarily that, it could be something which they identify as being a consequence of negligence or something worse on the part of their fellow citizens. It's not necessarily a failure of government that a community organisation might seek to redress. So, for example, as you know, I'm involved in the care of native wildlife. Well, native wildlife also belong to the people of Australia. That's the law. And it is the responsibility in this country of state governments to look after native wildlife on behalf of the citizens, on behalf of the humans, to look after native wildlife. The fact is that Australian governments don't devote much to this task at all. And the way that they discharge their responsibilities for caring for native wildlife is to licence volunteers. That's it. The organisation that I have belonged to for many years, many years, covers...
this is Wildcare.
This is Wildcare, and Wildcare is an organisation that is licensed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service of New South Wales to rescue, rehabilitate and then release back into the wild injured and orphaned native animals. All sorts of native animals, any native animal you might imagine. And the area that it covers, it surrounds the ACT, it's 20,000 square kilometres. This one small community organisation, it has about 250 members. And like any community organisation, and I'm sure you've all had this experience, with 250 members, maybe 25 of them are active, maybe 10% are really active. And so you've got a couple of dozen people who are looking after all of the native animals in that 20,000 square kilometre area. And you might imagine that the National Parks and Wildlife Service would provide this organisation with resources. Well, I don't know, in the 10 years or so that I've been associated with the organisation, the organisation's probably received a few $1,000s from government. That would be it. So it wouldn't be, certainly couldn't be $10,000. I doubt that it would be $5,000. That's it. All the resources come from people. So what sort of resources am I talking about? Well, I have myself purchased several hundred acres of land, I should say hectares, of land on which to erect at my own expense facilities for the rehabilitation of injured and orphaned wildlife, and to provide a refuge for these animals to be released back into. And there are several members of the organisation who have done the same thing, purchased several hundred hectares of land or for precisely the same purpose. The native animals have to be fed with special formula. You can't provide cow's milk to lactose intolerant animals. It kills them pretty quickly. That formula is very, very expensive. It's provided by the members of the organisation. They pay out of their own pocket for this stuff. Now, is this a failing on the part of the National Parks and Wildlife Service of New South Wales? But the thing is that the animals come into the care of people like me because they've been damaged by another human, another citizen of the same community, who in most cases, and it is a bit disturbing, but one nevertheless has to confront it. In most cases, these animals are retrieved from the pouch of their mother. It could be a kangaroo, a wallaby, a wombat, whatever. I'm talking about the marsupial mammals here. They're retrieved from the pouch of the mother having been hit by a car, the driver having driven on and left the animal on the side of the road. On many occasions, perhaps not most, but let's say 30 or 40% of the occasions, the mother is still alive. Somebody like me gets a call from a passing motorist, there's a kangaroo injured on the side of the road. We have a 24/7 phone line system. And somebody like me, and I've done it many times myself, goes out in the middle of the night, retrieves the baby from the pouch and has to shoot the mother. This is the business. It's not entirely a gap in what governments do that has people like me drawn to this sort of community work. It's in part a reaction to the fact that others who live in the community choose to allow this to happen.
Can I jump to a parallel thing? Epping Forest in central Queensland,
Yep.
where you and Naomi, your wife, took time to involve yourself there in the cause of the northern hairy-nosed wombat.
That's right.
More in danger than the Sumatran tiger.
Indeed it is.
So, looking after injured wildlife is one thing. Dealing with a species which is on the brink of extinction is quite another. You'd think in terms of where governments ought to be acting. And it's a serious matter. It's not megafauna, but it's a large piece of fauna.
I have thought quite a lot about that, and it's tempting to answer that question in the affirmative, but I'm not sure that's right. And the reason I'm not sure it's right.
What question are you?
Well, I imagine what you're saying is that if we're talking about an animal that's on the brink of extinction, the case for government involving itself in providing substantial resources is a pretty overwhelming case.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but I'm not sure I would want to draw the distinction.
All right.
And the reason, with so-called abundant species, and the reason I wouldn't want to rush to accepting that distinction is that there is a reason why animals become on the brink of extinction.
Habitat loss.
Well, it's because until they're on the brink of extinction, the common view is that they are abundant. And it's only when they're on the brink of extinction that any value is really placed on them. Consider that up until shortly before the last thylacine, Tasmanian tiger, became extinct, there was a bounty on their heads, right? Shortly before the last one was extinct, there was a bounty on their heads. Last year, some fellow in Australia offered a bounty, a reverse bounty, of $1 million, could have been $2 million, to any scientist who could bring one back from the dead. Humans are funny, you know. When we lose something, we attach enormous value to it, but only once we've lost it. So a thylacine, when we've got 100 of them, they have negative value. Apparently, there's a bounty on their heads. You can actually kill one and the government will pay you for the service you've done to the community. When we have no thylacines, one is worth $1 million, $2 million. It's an extraordinary thing. And so that's why I hesitate in joining your conclusion that there's a much clearer case. Whilst there is a very clear case, I'm not sure it's a clearer case. Take the state of the eastern grey kangaroo. The eastern grey kangaroo is commonly regarded as the most abundant native animal in Australia. In the last 10 years, governments in Australia have issued licences to allow the commercial harvesting, it's called, the killing of 50 million of them, just under 50 million of them. I'm pretty sure, in looking at our history of species destruction, 115 in the last 230 years, that we will wipe this animal out. I'm pretty sure we will. And it's only after we've wiped the animal out, I think, that we will appreciate its true value.
So let's bring this back to economics and your role in Treasury.
Yeah.
How do these things reconcile themselves, these sort of philosophical interests you have, much wider than economics, but in a way do belong to the world of economics too?
Well, indeed, they do belong to the world of economics. In the Treasury, certainly in the time that I've had responsibility for thinking about what the Treasury's purpose in life should be, what its mission should be, the Treasury has committed itself to improving the well-being of the Australian people. It's a very strong commitment. It's a mission that unifies the people in the organisation. But what do we mean by well-being? And we've had quite an intensive exercise in the Treasury over several years that's really been a conversation about well-being. Well-being is obviously something more than gross domestic product or gross domestic product per capita. In the framework that we use in the Treasury today, our concept of well-being embraces material concepts that would go into almost anybody's concept of a standard of living. But it extends well beyond material concepts to include things like environmental amenity, to include things like the level of complexity in citizens' interactions with government, whether it be through the tax system, which as you know is inordinately complex, whether it be through the transfer payment system, which for aged people in particular is extraordinarily complex. So complexity, particularly complexity in citizens' relationships with government, the level of risk that people have to bear, some of which governments can influence. This resonates strongly actually when you talk to economists about, mainstream economists, about risk as a public policy issue. They understand it instinctively because they've all learnt at some level macroeconomics. And macroeconomics is all about managing volatility. Managing volatility in aggregate macroeconomic performance that exposes people to very real risk, quite confronting risk, the risk in particular of losing your job, losing your standard of living. In addition to complexity and risk and something that we call consumption possibilities, which is the thing that goes well beyond gross domestic product per capita to encapsulate things like environmental amenity. We also have a strong focus on distributional issues. We have a strong focus on intertemporal distributional issues. You can see this through the work that we do in intergenerational reports, which is very much a question about intertemporal distribution. What is the legacy that this generation leaves to the next generation and subsequent generations in terms of the fiscal financing requirement? But as soon as we started talking about intergenerational reports, we got interested in a much broader question than the fiscal financing task. We got interested in how was the changing age structure of the population going to affect levels of workforce participation? And indeed, how was the changing age structure of the population going to affect participation in the labour force in general? And how is the changing age structure of the population what is it going to demand of governments of the future that we presently don't provide, or if we do provide it, we provide it with a level of infrastructure that will prove simply inadequate to the task? I mean, imagine, just conceive of this for a moment, that we today are projecting that 40 years from now the Australian population will be 35 million people, another 13 million Australians, that we will go through a period of population growth faster than any other 40-year period of Australia's history. A larger population increase than at any other time in our history. When we produced the last intergenerational report, which was only 2 years ago, we were projecting a 40-year out population of 28.5 million people. Somehow we've managed to find another 7 million Australians 40 years hence. Even when we had that population projection of 28.5 million people, we were projecting that with that which is another 6.5 million Australians, or 7 million Australians relative to what we have today, we were projecting that there'd be another 4.5 million people living on the strip of coastline between Sydney and Brisbane. Well, you can pretty much double that now. Pretty much, maybe not quite double it. We were also projecting that the number of people aged 65 or more living on the coast between Sydney and Brisbane would increase by 4 million people. Not in Sydney or Brisbane, but on that strip of coastline. Where is the infrastructure to support another 4 or 5 million Australians aged 65 plus on that strip of coastline? Right? So when you think about intergenerational challenges as a distributional issue, you quickly get drawn into questioning the ability of governments to provide services to to generations of the future. But right at the heart of our wellbeing framework is something which is rather more fundamental than anything I've said. It's also more abstract, but it's more compelling. And at the heart of our wellbeing framework sits this concept of freedom and opportunity. It's a concept that's been heavily influenced by the writings of the Nobel Prize-winning economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen talks a lot about citizens enjoying the capabilities that would allow them to choose lives that they have reason to value. Now, without dwelling too much on that they have reason to value, which is quite a complex philosophical point, let's just truncate it and say, for the purposes of this discussion, that we will interpret this as ensuring that all Australians have the capabilities that would allow them to choose lives of value. Lives which everybody in this room would regard as being a valuable life, let's suppose. Well, what does it take to ensure that citizens enjoy the capabilities that would allow them to choose a life of value? It takes a lot. It certainly takes a good education system. It certainly takes a good health system. It takes a system of governance that allows for full and free engagement in the democratic process. It also takes community organisations. It takes people like those in this room or me when I do my wildcare work who plug the gaps that are there that just fall out of our particular system of governance. And accepting that should be our mission, that's the way we should think about our mission, as ensuring that Australians have those capabilities, has led us into some very interesting places. So, for example, when Noel Pearson, the Cape York Institute, called and said, look, I need some help in putting together some thinking about the policy requirements on the Cape, I seconded 2 Treasury people to the Cape York Institute. I think for 6 years we had 2 Treasury people seconded, not the same people, we rotated them, but people seconded to the Cape York Institute. Noel, by the way, was on a similar journey. He was also reading Amartya Sen, and guess what? The Cape York Institute articulates its vision as ensuring that the Indigenous peoples of the Cape have the capabilities that would allow them to choose lives of value.
Ken, I'm going to leave it there. And for the purposes of our camera, can I say, Ken, I can't remember a public servant in your position of prominence giving us such an insight into your philosophical underpinnings for much of the work you do. So I'd like to thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.